Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to Oranmore Library this evening for Galway Public Library's Galway's Great Read 2020 entitled Eilís Dillon, Language, Landscape and Legacy. This evening we are celebrating Eilís Dillon, the Patriot, in our historic themed seminar, Eilís Dillon, Politics and Patriotism. Galway's Great Read promotes our literary heritage, our history and our unique culture. It fosters an appreciation for its diversity and richness. This year, we are celebrating the life and work of one of Galway's most versatile writers, Eilís Dillon, through a programme of events and commissions. We are delighted this evening then to invite our guests, Eileán, poet and daughter of Eilís, Honor Ó Brolchain, her niece, Honor will join us virtually, and Caitriona Clear, NUIG historian. Musicians this evening are Tomás Mannion and Carmel Dempsey, and our facilitator is Emily Cullen, poet, writer and harper. Thank you and we hope you enjoy.
Marching men in squadrons passed me by. No fife did harm, or battle drum did haunt its dread tattoo. But the Angelus bell, oh, the lippy swell rang out in the foggy dew. Right proudly high over Dublin town, they hung out the flag of war. 'Twas better to die neath an Irish sky than at Suvla or Sood Elbar. And from the plains of Royal Meath, strong men came hurrying through. Britannia's guns with their long-range guns sailing through the foggy dew. Might shine through the foggy dew. Oh, back through the glen I road again, and my heart with grief was sore. For I parted then with those valiant men that I ne'er shall see no more. Ah, but to and fro in my dreams I go, and I kneel and pray for you. For slavery fled, oh you glorious dead, when you fell in the foggy dew.
Thanks so much to Tomás Mannion and Carmel Dempsey for that beautiful, soulful rendition of The Foggy Dew. Fáilte a cóide go dtí an ócáid speisialta seo mar cuid de léamh mór na Gaillimhe agus mar cuid de Comóra céad bliain Eilís Dillon. You're all very welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this special occasion, our seminar on Eilís Dillon, Politics and Patriotism, as part of Galway's Great Read and the 2020 Eilís Dillon celebrations. As Patricia mentioned, each year Galway's Great Read commemorates a literary figure or historical event through readings, exhibitions, talks and reminiscences of life in Galway and Ireland during a specific period. Galway Public Libraries have been doing this now for 7 years, and it's getting bigger each year, and this is the biggest yet because of the centenary events this year for Eilís Dillon. And we've already had a very successful run of events, including the National Eilís Dillon Book Club, which took place during the month of October and indeed had some international participants. We also had a wonderful education project, One Author, Five Islands, with Sive Devlin, which involved all the island schools reading Eilís Dillon's books, Island of the Horses and Family of Foxes. And then we had a wonderful launch event for this overall initiative in the Town Hall Theatre on the 1st of October in partnership with Court Festival of Literature. And that night of music and song and readings is up online for you to enjoy. And yet to come, we have a special art commission with Ruth O'Donnell and a music commission from Martin O'Connor. Last but not least, of course, we have our 3 seminars today underway with a host of special guests, focusing on Eilís Dillon's detective fiction, on her historical writing, and on her politics and patriotism. For information on all the events happening, and because we are going to stream some of these sessions online later this month, please check our Galway Public Library's Facebook page and the Galway Public Library's YouTube channel. Centenaries provide us with an opportune generational moment to reappraise a writer's work at an important juncture, 100 years since their birth. We're afforded a special window to take stock of both the writer's oeuvre, examining it retrospectively in the historical context of its own time, while also taking a longer view of it from the contemporary moment. During the month of October, when I had the pleasure of facilitating the National Online Eilís Dillon Book Club, many interesting questions were posed and pondered about Eilís Dillon's novel, The Bitter Glass, published in 1958, and more broadly about other aspects of her life and legacy. And I'm delighted to tell you that the book club has had a catalytic effect and generated new research ideas on Eilís Dillon, with a pledge from scholars such as Dr. Maureen O'Connor at UCC to publish an essay on Dillon's work in the context of Irish war writing. So it's very exciting to witness the generative possibilities of centenary celebrations and how they can spawn a fresh look at a writer's life and legacy. So to return to Eilís Dillon in the context of Galway, her place of her birth and her childhood, I came upon this lovely, insightful quotation which I'd like to share with you. It's taken from an article written by Eilís Dillon and published in 1993, a year before her death, and it's in the Cork Review, and the piece is entitled A Writer in Cork. Dillon observes that the hinterland around Galway was the perfect setting for a potential writer, intent on observing human nature in all its variations. The way was made easier by the fact that I spoke Irish as easily as English, so that no nuance was lost on me. Adults and children were always together and conversation was uninhibited. So I think that's a nice note to begin the session about Eilís Dillon, politics and patriotism. And we have 3 wonderful guest speakers.
her daughter Eileán Chuilleanáin, the renowned poet and scholar, her niece and godchild, Honor Ó Brolchain, a renowned historian, and another renowned historian from NUI Galway, Dr. Caitriona. Our first speaker this evening is Eilís Dillon's daughter, Eileán Chuilleanáin. Cork-born Eileán is an Emeritus Fellow of Trinity College Dublin and was Ireland Professor of Poetry between 2016 and 2019. She has published academic work on the Renaissance, on translation and on Irish writing. Originally with MacDara Woods, Pierce Hutchison and Leland Bardwell, she has edited since 1975 the Irish poetry journal Ciphers. She has published 9 collections of poetry over 47 years, most recently The Mother House from Gallery Press in Ireland and Wake Forest University Press in North Carolina. The Mother House received the Irish Times Poetry Now Award 2020, and her collected poems recently appeared from Gallery Press. Eileán, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Emily. Well, Eilís's politics and patriotism are bound up with the history of Ireland. In blood relations, somebody asks, what is it makes the Irish act like this? And the answer is history and songs. The particular history, of course, is the history of the War of Independence. And what I'm going to talk about is one of her children's books, The Seals. I think Eilís had a particular sense of responsibility when she was writing for children, not to distort the truth, not to say things that would frighten or were to be over-realistic, but to stick to things that she felt were important. In the piece I'm going to read, there's the importance of the Irish language, as you'll hear. There's also the importance of custom and folklore. What's happening here is that a bunch of black and tans have landed in the house of a woman where she's sheltering 2 boys who've come to look for the uncle of one of them, who in fact has been captured by the black and tans. They're demanding food. Soon she had a huge dish full of bacon and eggs, and as she set this on the table in front of the men, she said in Irish, "May it do you no good. A Christian can't say, I hope it will poison you." "What's that you said?" the officer asked suspiciously. "It's a kind of prayer we say when we put the food on the table," she said calmly. "Ah yes, you Irish are full of prayers, though you're up to no good the rest of the time. And queer songs you have too." "Those are the old songs. I know a lot of them myself. Let you be eating up now, and I'll sit by the fire there and be entertaining you with a bit of music." "Fine, fine, but make it cheerful." When she had cut bread for them and had made a big pot of tea, she settled in her chair again and picked up her knitting. She did not start work on it, however, but let it lie in her lap. Then she began to sing in a surprisingly sweet, strong voice in Irish. The tune was one the 2 boys knew well because it was very popular in Connemara. It had a slow rhythm and every line was decorated with grace notes and turns. With the first words, they knew what she was doing. She sang, "Oh boy, sitting there on my hob, you with the black hair, go out through the bedroom window in a little while and unhitch your horse. There's a back way out of that shed and a lane that will take you to the road. Go along the road to Furbo village, 9 miles, and go to John Walsh's house." She managed to make it sound like a real song by making the vowel sounds correspond at the end of each 2 lines. The boys were astonished at the contrast between her quick thinking and her calm appearance. When she drew breath for the second verse, one of the men said, "That's not what I call cheerful." Mrs. Curran took no notice. She went on singing. "Tell John Walsh that Rory is on the lorry with the crew beanie, and if they get him into Galway, they'll know him from a picture they have. So the cars must be stopped at Furbo, and Rory must be rescued tonight, and when you have him safe, boy, you can bring him back here." "That's enough of that," said the first officer, happy with his bacon and eggs. "Now we'll have something quicker. "We will so if you don't like the old songs," Mrs. Curran said. And she began on a lively love song about a young man who ran away with a beautiful girl who was also rich.
Thank you very much, Eileán, for that lovely reading. Our second speaker this evening, Honor Ó Brolchain, spent 40 years in music, performing, teaching and examining, and the last 20 years researching and writing about the Plunkett and Dillon families, resulting in 2 books, All in the Blood, published by A.A. Farmer in 2006, an edition of the memoirs of her grandmother, Geraldine Plunkett Dillon, and Joseph Plunkett, published by O'Brien Press in 2012 as part of the 16 Live series. Joseph Plunkett, of course, was one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising and a signatory of the Proclamation of Independence. Honor has also published research on her great-grandfather, Count Plunkett, in Roscommon History and Society, and she has given seminars on her grandfather, Thomas Dillon, Professor of Chemistry for 35 years at NUI Galway. The writer Eilís Dillon was her aunt and her godmother. Honor is joining us virtually now.
Honor Ó Brolchain, Eilís Dillon was my aunt, and I'm pleased to say she was also my godmother. Her parents were a Dillon and a Plunkett, and in those families, words of all kinds, written and spoken, were tremendously important right through the centuries. So I hope to show you a little bit about the history of these 2 families. The Plunketts were Danish and probably came in the 1030s when Danish rule in England came to an end. And the Dillons were Normans and came to Ireland in 1185 with Prince John. Danish John Plunkett died in 1082. He's the first recorded Plunkett death in Ireland. He died in Baylin, County Louth, which was later rechristened Bewley. Now the Eileán and Dunsany castles, and indeed Trim Castle also, were built by Hugh de Lacy as defences against Strongbow on the request of Henry II. But Strongbow died on his way up through the country when he was conquering in 1176 and never made it to Meath or Louth or Plunkett territory at all. The castles were bought by Lucas Cusack, whose daughter Joan married Christopher Plunkett in 1399. So he acquired these castles, and that was usually the way that Plunketts and Dillons acquired land and money. That Plunkett, Christopher Plunkett, was created Lord Eileán in the 1420s, and his brother was created Lord Dunsany in the 1460s. And our side of the family, so to speak, is descended from that Lord Eileán. Now, moving to the terrible times of the 17th century, Lucas Mór Plunkett, whose parents were a Plunkett and a Dillon, was created first Earl of Fingal in 1628, and in fact Lucas Dillon was created Earl of Roscommon in the 1620s also. The brothers and sisters of Lucas Mór Plunkett included Nicholas, who was a great lawyer and the chairman of the Confederation of Kilkenny, in fact one of the brains behind it, and it was perhaps the first attempt to unify all of the factions and all of Ireland. Patrick, another brother, was the Bishop of Ardagh and Meath, and the nephew, Oliver, who came from Loughcrew, but he came and was educated at Eileán amongst all these extraordinary people. He became Archbishop of Armagh and Primate of all Ireland, but he had to remain underground for all of his tenure because being a member of the Catholic hierarchy was illegal. He got up the nose of the authorities and was executed at Tyburn in 1681 in England. He was created a saint in 1975. His sons, Lucas Mór's sons, were Christopher and George, and they were in the Confederation's Patriot Army and both fought in the Battle of Drogheda in 1641. Christopher also fought in the Battle of Rathmines in 1649 against Cromwell's troops, and he was wounded and died in prison in Dublin Castle. Coming now to the 19th century, and these are some of the Dillon relations, Tom Dillon's granduncles, who include the young Irelander John Blake Dillon, a very eminent and extraordinary man, a great journalist who contributed to the Nation journal, which was started by John Blake Dillon and Tom Davis and by Charles Gavin Duffy. They were looking for a new culture and a new type of nationalism. They were very important. Valentine Blake Dillon, his brother, was Lord Mayor of Dublin for a while, but he was also Parnell's solicitor. Anne Dean was a niece of John Blake Dillon's. Her name also was a Dillon originally. And she was a very important member of the family in that she was the brains in politics. People came from all over Ireland and indeed from England to find out what she thought about the situation and what she thought should be done. So she was very important politically. She became the president of the Ladies' Land League and ran and owned an enormous shop in Ballahadreen, the biggest shop in Connacht at the time. A son of John Blake Dillon's was John Dillon, who became the deputy leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party later on. He was also a leader for a little while. A very bright man, but a ferocious misogynist. It was thanks to the aforementioned Anne Dean that Tom Dillon went to Clongowes Wood. The schools around Ballahadreen and Ballina hadn't taken off and didn't have enough money to produce good education, so she funded his education for a few years in Clongowes, and against all expectations, he got a scholarship from there to the Royal University in Cork. By coincidence, his grandfather, William K. Sullivan, had been the second president of the previous college, the Queen's College Cork. The Royal University was really only an examining body and was rather ramshackle in the way it worked. And Tom Dillon was able to go around and try and work out what he was going to do during the first year. And he found the lectures of the great Augustus Dixon, lecturing in chemistry, and it made up his mind. He loved chemistry, he loved the lectures, and this was the way that he was going to go. Now, to return to the more Plunkett side, these are some of Eilís's great-grandparents. So on the left, Patrick Plunkett, who came from County Meath. They had a farm adjoining the Killeen Castle in County Meath, but his parents died during the famine and the farm became unmanageable, so all 14 children scattered to all places in the world. But Patrick Plunkett came to Dublin, and there he met Elizabeth Noble, who had a shop of her own on Ainger Street selling leather. And she also had some money of her own. He went into the building business. He was apprenticed to a contractor and wanted to build his own houses. So Elizabeth Noble's money was a great help in setting that up. They had 3 children, but only one of them survived, George, who always called himself George Noble after his mother. She died in 1873. Sadly, I don't have a photograph of her. And Pat Plunkett married again, Helena O'Sullivan, and they had 4 children. Patrick Cranny had gone from Carlow to Tralee. He was a journeyman shoemaker. There he met Maria Keane, and they came to Dublin and got married and started a shoe shop. They had a very prestigious shoe shop on George's Street, which was very successful, but he didn't want to go on with it when mechanisation came in. He wanted to go into building. By an amazing coincidence, Maria Keane had money of her own from her family, and that enabled him to go into the building business. He built extensively in Donnybrook and in Ballsbridge. And they had 4 children, the survivors of 17 pregnancies which Maria Keane had. It's interesting that the women who provide the money in this case, and that was not uncommon. And here in 1884 is the marriage of 2 children of those 2 families. George Noble Plunkett and Josephine Mary Cranny were in fact second cousins, and George Noble Plunkett had now been designated Count Plunkett by the Pope because he had given a villa to an order of nuns in Rome. They were surrounded here by their family. Both fathers are here, Patrick Cranny and Patrick Plunkett, the builders, Maria Cranny, 3 Cranny brothers, Father Sebastian Burke, who officiated at the ceremony, the new wife, Helena O'Sullivan, and her first child, Germaine, who's sitting on the steps at the bottom, and Frank Cranny, who'd come back from Australia with his daughter. She's sitting on the steps at the bottom. Here on the left is Count Plunkett, George Plunkett, a bit younger. He worked in the law. He was an art scholar and was very much involved in literature, wrote several books, and his friends included a strong assortment as Isaac Butt, who started the Home Rule Party, Roger Casement, who was executed by the English in 1916, Douglas Hyde, pioneer of Irish, Charles Stewart Parnell, the politician, Catherine Tynan, the poet, Oscar Wilde, the writer, and Bram Stoker, author of Dracula. Some of these he met in Trinity College when he was doing law. On the right is Josephine Plunkett, who wasn't keen on domestic affairs and didn't get on very well with most of her children. Jo is the honourable exception, really. And the young Plunketts, 7 of them. Now, their correct order in age is Mimi, Jo, Moya, Jerry, George, Fina, and Jack. And they were to have an assortment of ambitions and desires. They had a tough time at home, and it bonded them very close together. They cared a lot about each other. Eilís's parents, Tom Dillon and Geraldine Plunkett met in 1909 in the newly formed UCD. He was lecturing in chemistry and she had gone there to do a medical degree in Cecilia Street, where he was doing part of the lecturing. She found that the medical degree was chaotic and she didn't enjoy it, so she transferred to chemistry, where she fell in love with both it and her lecturer, Tom Dillon. They got engaged a few years later, they became great friends, and they got married in 1916, so it was a long haul. But Geraldine did us the great favour of writing down her ancestry and her family history and gave us a great perspective on the whole thing. Eilís Dillon's uncle, Joseph Plunkett, known often as Joseph Mary Plunkett, but in fact known to everybody else as Joe, was intermittently ill. He had glandular tuberculosis. He had been in Algiers for his health in 1911, and while he was there, his great friend Tomás MacDonagh had seen his first book of poetry, Joe's first book of poetry, through the press, The Circle and the Sword. When he was not ill, Joe had been asked to take over the Irish Review, which was a remarkable journal in which everybody who was anybody wrote about arts, literature and politics. Because of Joe's illness, their mother offered Joe and Geraldine the use of a house of hers in Marlborough Road, so that Geraldine could be his housekeeper, nurse, and try and do her degree at the same time. And he and Tom Dillon became great friends. And in 1913, during the lockout and strike, Joe and Tom were on the Peace Committee and went round Dublin on a motorbike like this to try to persuade the employers and the workers to talk to each other, because the workers were having such frightful conditions and terrible pay. The workers would talk, but the employers wouldn't. The story of these few years is too big to tell, and I'm not going to try to tell the story of 1916. It's been written about many times. But from the point of view of the Plunketts, these four were supposed to get married on Easter Sunday of 1916. Joe Plunkett, Grace Gifford, Tom Dillon and Jerry Plunkett. But the catastrophes surrounding the rising meant that Joe couldn't be there. He had so many meetings on, including, of course, about the countermanding order from Owen MacNeill. Joe told Tom and Jerry to go and stay in the Imperial Hotel on the right at the bottom in O'Connell Street, and that meant that they had a ringside seat, because you can see on the opposite side, that's the GPO just sticking out. So they watched on Monday morning as the men arrived to take over the GPO, as Joe came out to shoot a bomb off in an empty tram, as Pearse came out to read the proclamation, as the Lancers galloped down the street and the population started looting the shops. It was an extraordinary day, and eventually they got orders that they were to go home and make more gun cotton, just in case the rising had any more success than they could possibly have expected. By the end of the week, by Friday, in fact, the GPO was so hot with the fires around that Joe and his brothers Jack and George, who were also in the GPO, had to leave with the others and spend a night in Moore Street in the houses and then surrender on the Saturday. Joe marched the men from Moore Street back up O'Connell Street, and they were made to lay on the grass overnight at the Rotunda. They were marched to Richmond Barracks the next day, and as they arrived there, Joe fainted. He was very ill. He'd had his operation on his neck, and he probably only had a few weeks to live anyway. In Richmond Barracks by now there were 5 Plunketts, but most of them didn't know about the others. Joe, Jack and George were in the gymnasium, and Jack and George were sent off almost immediately to English jails. They had drumhead court-martials, and Joe had to wait for his court-martial until the following Tuesday. His father had already been arrested and was in one part of the barracks, and his mother had been arrested and she was in another part of the barracks. It was a very strange situation. The parents were never told that their son was executed, that Joe and Grace had got married, which they did very late at night on that night of the Tuesday the 3rd, and on the Wednesday the 4th of May Joe was executed. In Richmond Barracks, before Joe left, he was standing out in the yard there, and he looked up and he saw his father in the window. Neither of them had known the other was there, and they looked at each other for a long time before Joe was marched off to Kilmainham to his marriage and his death. The question after the 1916 rising was what to do next. The Count and Countess Plunkett had been exiled to Oxford and had to stay there. And during the next few months, when a by-election was due in North Roscommon, the extraordinary Father Michael O'Flanagan realised that to ask Count Plunkett to stand would probably have an impact. Count Plunkett agreed, came back in January without permission, and in an election which was heavily impeded with snow, he was elected with a great majority and then declared himself abstentionist. In other words, he was not going to take his seat in the House of Commons. This election was followed by the election of Joe McGuinness, who was still in jail, and this was for Longford, and again people turned up to support him. The third election was De Valera in County Clare, and the fourth W.T. Cosgrave in Kilkenny. In all these elections, people came from all over the country to help and support, to do pamphleteering and driving and so on. And Tom Dillon was one of the people who went to all the elections and helped out. But poor Jerry had to stay at home because she was having a bad pregnancy and couldn't go. The bottom left is a photograph of Count Plunkett's convention in the Mansion House 1917, when all parties were invited to discuss what should happen next. And above that on the left is Tom Dillon, who was jailed in 1918 as part of a campaign against the anti-conscription campaign. He was now Secretary of Sinn Féin, and he was jailed in Gloucester from then until January of 1919. The photograph in the middle is of his two daughters, Moya on the right, who was born in 1917, and on the left, sitting in the chair, my mother, Plunkett, who was born 3 weeks after he was jailed. Pat Plunkett also died, Jerry's grandfather, and Tom Dillon's mother died. Elizabeth Sullivan died after he'd left, or after he'd been taken away. Now, New Sinn Féin, they had taken the name from Arthur Griffith. He'd given his permission for them to use the name for the new party. And they now created the first Dáil, but only 27 TDs out of the many elected in the 1918 election were there because the rest were still in jail. And in the centre of the photograph is Count Plunkett introducing the Dáil to the world and to Ireland. While he was still in Gloucester jail, Tom Dillon's wife Jerry had seen the advertisement for a post of Professor of Chemistry in University College Galway, UCG, and she had made the application and she had got references, and when he got home from Gloucester at the end of January, missing the first Dáil, she sent him off to Galway for the interview, wearing her coat because he didn't have a coat of his own. He got the job and he was there for 35 years, always described as distinguished and outstanding because he gave very many people a lifelong love of chemistry. He also enabled the first 3 women professors of chemistry in Ireland. And on the left you have a photograph of the model school, which for a time was the chemistry department and also for a time housed the Dillons while it was still full of rats and leaks. Eilís Dillon was born when they were in Galway in 1920. She was born in March, and they were all in for a terrible time. The Dillons had presumed that they were going to have a bad time because they expected to be watched by the police, but in fact they didn't know for a little while that they were there. After only a few months, added to the RIC and the military who were already there in Galway were the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries, and by now there were nearly twice as many military and police in Galway as there were citizens. The Galway people had all these terrible things to endure, and Jerry Plunkett Dillon tried to ensure that it was all recorded. She wrote as much as possible as she could about it. They were tortured and beaten and dragged behind cars and half drowned and gun whipped, and houses and shops and villages burned, and very often with people inside them. And the Dillons lived for a time. One of the many houses they lived in was this on Teachberg Bawn at the end of Salt Hill. It's gone now. Jerry could see from this house the Black and Tans loading up the lorries, going out to raids with guns in one hand and bottles of whiskey in the other. A very dangerous combination. The reason they're in 14 houses was because of being on the run so much, and very often they had to stay in friends' houses and leave the children in another friend's house. Very terrible times. At the beginning of 1921, when they were living on Sea Road in Montpellier Terrace, Tom Dillon was elected to the town council. But even before he was elected, there was a raid on their house, unsuccessful fortunately at that time, as Jerry managed to scream murder out the window, and Tom Dillon managed to get out the back in his pyjamas with his trousers over his shoulder. The police didn't get in that time, but they did get in the next time. Jerry had been found in the middle of town. She was stopped and searched by the police, and they found on her papers which were giving accounts of the beatings of the prisoners in Galway jail. She was keeping them for the journalists and for the propaganda machine from the First Dáil. They wanted to arrest her, so they came to the house, and she wasn't in, and Tom wasn't in. He was at work, and the 3 children were being minded by Peggy. Peggy, I think, was only in her late teens. I don't know her second name, sadly. They got into the house, and this was a real tan raid. They draped underwear all over the place. They took stuff out of the laundry basket. They draped sanitary towels around like decorations. They burned all the books in Irish, and they got Moya to take them out to the garden. They said they were looking for her mother, and she wasn't in the garden, of course, but they told her that they were going to kill her when they found her. It was horrible. Moya was 4, Plunkett was 2, and Eilís was 13 months old. She was always referred to as the baby, but 13 months is old enough to have been totally terrified by such horrible occurrences. Jerry was jailed in Galway jail, and she was there for a few months before a question was asked in the House of Commons about her and about the children, and she was just let out. There were plenty more houses, but just 2 to finish with. And this was Dungan House in 1924, and of course now the treaty was over, the new government was in, but Tom Dillon's salary had gone down to very little. So when they took out a mortgage and he got into financial trouble, they had to give it up again. It was a haven. It has several acres of trees and green around it, and in the middle you can see Plunkett age 6 and Eilís age 4 going off for some adventure somewhere in Dungan House grounds. Absolutely wonderful. They moved from there to Barna, where they could afford a couple of cottages on the pier. And here, everything came together for all of them. They loved it. They were only there a shortish time, but they had a wonderful time. And Eilís has written fantastic stuff about it inside Ireland, her 1983 book. Here, they learned Irish songs, Irish poems. They traipsed around the countryside. And Eilís was regarded by her siblings as very hardy. And I think she loved this outdoor adventure. And I think that's what made her children's books so true and so wonderful to read. So here they are in order. Moya, who became a doctor, Plunkett, who became a solicitor, Michael, who is an agricultural journalist and a farmer, marvellous man, and Owen, who is a great hotelier, and of course Eilís with her enormous repertoire and her changing repertoire all her life. Her parents, Tom Dillon and Geraldine Plunkett, lived to be 87 and 94 respectively. I knew all these people one way or another. It was a great privilege. They were generous, huge personalities, greatly talented, and when they were all in one room together, I thought the walls wouldn't hold them.
Thank you very much, Honor, for that paper. While You Were in Kilkenny Town, by Geraldine Plunkett Dillon to her husband Thomas Dillon, Dublin, August 1917. While you were in Kilkenny Town, I see your grace in every tree. Your hair is as the beeches brown, the birches have your bravery. Your strength in mountain oaks I find, eagles in this have built their nest. With supple sally twigs you bind my willing heart unto your breast. Cypress and cedar spreading wide, under your peace my heart will sleep. O rowan tree that grows beside my pool of love, your roots drink deep. Our next speaker is Dr. Caitriona Clear. Caitriona lectures in modern history in NUI Galway and has published on the history of nuns, women's household work, oral history, on general Irish society, and on women's magazines in the 1950s and 60s. Caitriona is currently interested in Irish popular writing and reading of the 1930s to the 1960s. And we're delighted to welcome her here this evening.
Thanks, Emily, for the introduction. And today I'm going to talk about Across the Bitter Sea in particular as a historical novel. The previous speaker, Anne-Marie, has spoken about what a vividly written evocation it is of the Galway landscape, and I would say the built environment as well. I love the way Eilís Dillon describes houses and armchairs and beds and clothes and so on. It makes for a very textured read. But I'm not here as a literary scholar, I suppose I'm here as a historian. And the first thing I want to say about Across the Bitter Sea is that it's meticulously researched. From the names of the families caught up in the Battle of Carrow during the Land War, to prison conditions in England in the 1860s and 70s, from the fragile and kind of febrile famine, post-famine recovery in Kappa in County Galway by the early 1850s, all on down as far as the by-election in Kilkenny in 1891. Dillon doesn't just describe what the characters are doing, she describes the towns, she describes the streets, she describes the houses, everything as well. But a historical novel can be meticulously researched and can still get it wrong. by projecting current attitudes onto the past, or by using the benefit of hindsight to evaluate the past. Just an example of this would be some writers about the First World War who imagine that all the participants in it, the soldiers and so on, were all cynical and world-weary all the way through, when in fact some of them were as idealistic and enthusiastic in 1918 as they had been in 1914. So, you know, we can sometimes project onto the past. What struck me forcibly reading Across the Bitter Sea was the way Dillon remained faithful all through the book to the social and political values and beliefs that people would have had at that time. And I'm going to take a few instances. For example, Alice marries Samuel because her parents set up the match for her. She's, of course, tempted as well by being a gentleman's wife. Samuel is the son of George Flaherty, and she's tempted by having a life of ease, and that's very well done, I think, too. But she's in love with Morgan Connolly. She's loved him all her life, and she has to give him up. And if her parents hadn't suggested Samuel, she would have married Morgan. And she doesn't feel any resentment towards her parents on this account. She believes that it's their right to marry her off and that they're acting in her best interest. And that is the way a lot of people felt about matches in the past and in the world today. Indeed, a lot of people still feel like that. Alice's mother, Mary MacDonagh, is a different story. Mary MacDonagh Nee Hogan, whose own mother also decided Mary's destiny to a certain extent when she sent Mary off to be a nursemaid to George Flaherty's motherless son, Samuel, in the full knowledge that Flaherty wanted Mary as a mistress. He was widowed, newly widowed. Mary does bear some resentment against her mother for this. And the word tallywoman, Eilís Dillon uses the word tallywoman to describe Mary's status. It's a word I hadn't heard before, but I take Dillon's word for it that it was a word at the time because she's so right about other things. So Mary was George's mistress for 8 years. This is all before the action of the novel begins. She had a child who died, and then he more or less cast her off, and she marries Thomas MacDonagh and has a large family and a fairly happy, I suppose, destiny. Did this kind of thing happen? Of course it did. But there hasn't been much research on it. And I got wondering then about why there hasn't been much research. In fact, all the Irish women's history that's come out over the past 40 years, I don't think there's hardly anything in it about the kind of woman, about a woman being taken up as a mistress by a landlord or a gentry figure like that. It's mentioned tangentially maybe in Deborah Wilson's book about marriage and property settlement. And why hasn't there been more research about it? And I think probably because the rise in women's history happened at the same time as a lot of new research came out about relationships on the land, and a lot of the historical treatments of the land war and the land agitation and landlord-tenant relations came out in the 1970s and 80s, and they focused on the relationships between big farmers and small farmers, farmers and labourers, rather than on the relationships between landlords and tenants. Now, landlords weren't rehabilitated at all, but they were just rendered a little bit irrelevant by this historical narrative. And I think women's history might have followed that to a certain extent. And the sexual exploitation of women by landlords didn't fit into that story. And I think, as one of the people who's been writing women's history for the last 30 or so, 33 years or so, I couldn't quite fit that into my story either. The common or garden exploitation and oppression by husbands, fathers and employers we could more or less handle. This was a bit too exotic. There might also have been a certain sense of shame about it. I think Dillon is spot on historically at placing this relationship between Mary and George Flaherty, the landlord, in the late 18 teens and early 1820s. There's still a hangover of 18th century kind of free and easy gentry sexual mores at this time. But also more importantly, landlords still having an idea that they kind of owned their tenants, body and soul, and this idea would be challenged. It was already, of course, being challenged on the continent with the French Revolution and the abolition of feudalism, and it would be challenged quite significantly over the following 100 years in Ireland. But Mary still has these attitudes, and she still has the fear of the landlord. And one little piece where Mary is permanently affected by the exploitation. And this comes across when Samuel comes to her to ask for her daughter Alice's hand in marriage, and he can see straight away Mary's fear that she might have no choice in this. And I'm going to quote, "It seemed he had never before been truly aware of the injury done to her, to condition people to accept the inevitability of injustice and misfortune is, after all, the final achievement of a tyrant." That's just an example of the kind of beautiful writing in the book. Luckily, Samuel is an absolutely good man. And after Alice gets married to him, Samuel's father, George, the man who mistreated her mother, is still alive, and he asks her to bring her sister to live with them. And he kind of lasciviously has his eye out, so she decides she won't. Her generation, she's going to reject this. Besides, it wouldn't be appropriate for him to be preying on the sisters of his son's wife. Just moving on, talking about class here, Master Fahey, the schoolmaster, the hedge schoolmaster, more or less, who holds his classes in and around George Flaherty's house. He's a very well-drawn character, and his ambiguous social status, I think, is highlighted quite well. He sits and he eats dinners with the landlords, the Flahertys, but probably only because they're a little bit marginal in the landlord world because they're Catholics themselves and they're supporting him as a Catholic teacher. A school teacher in the 19th century was on a par socially with a tradesman and came from the same kind of background. Some memoirs like Mark Ryan's Fenian Memories, Mark Ryan was from out around Tuam and he wrote a book about it. He tells us that informal hedge school masters like Fahey in the book often limped or had a withered hand or some other disability, so they couldn't be put to a trade, so they were kept at the books, as the saying went. That said, being a master of this sort was an avenue to social mobility. And Dillon does this very well. The way Fahey is a little bit grandiloquent and a little bit proud of himself, but still he has reason to be. His son goes to the university, trains as a doctor, and finally actually goes to Britain and gets a job in the civil service. And this is quite believable. Teachers' children had definite advantages, not only because of the education their parents could guarantee for them, but also because of the confidence about learning that their parents bequeathed to them. There's other examples of the way culture sort of permeates the lives of the ordinary people here, the farming people. Thomas MacDonagh, Alice's father, Mary's husband, knows all the classical legends from Greece and Rome and tells them in Irish to his children. And the folklore records bear this out. A lot of old stories of Greece and Rome are told in Irish in the collections that were made by Comisiún Béile sa Éireann in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. These would have, it's an example of perhaps teachers, telling these stories to children, whether in hedge schools or in other schools, and then the stories passing into the oral tradition. So the oral tradition was a little bit dependent on the written tradition as well. And again, this is something that Dillon does very well. There's also the point about Morgan Connolly and the Fenianism, and because this section is about politics and patriotism, Morgan, who's the love of Alice's life, although she's married to Samuel, he's a small farmer's son from Kappa in County Galway, and he's a Fenian. And in fact, his Fenianism is the thread that's running through the book. Morgan is in many ways, Morgan and Alice are the book's main characters. Now, most Fenians were from the towns. They were from the urban, lower middle and working class, usually. O'Donovan Rossa, for example, was a small shopkeeper. The Beamish and Crawford workforce in Cork was largely composed of Fenians. And historians sometimes argue that while Britain had an organised, skilled labour movement in the 1860s and 70s, the equivalent in Ireland took the form of Fenianism. But there were also small farmers and labourers' sons in the Fenians. John Devoy from Kildare is one example. And Michael Davitt also, although he took the roundabout route through industrial work in England as well. Besides, small farmers from places like Galway and Mayo were far more like industrial workers than they were like farmers. They often worked for wages in cash or in kind locally or further afield, and when they emigrated permanently, they usually settled in urban areas and got sort of industrial or building work. So it's entirely believable that a small farmer's son like Morgan would have been a Fenian. It's also, I think, entirely believable that he would have learned French. He's already working in two languages, Irish and English, quite fluently. And I think the novel depicts people like Morgan, the backbone of the land movement, and it's very well the thread that runs through it right up to 1916. The IRB, or the Fenians, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, always kept in touch with constitutional politicians, and this comes across in the novel as well. There was not a huge divide between them. And this is shown in the arguments that James has with Morgan and Fergal in the 1890s. They're arguing, but they're still talking to one another. Even when Fergal describes home rulers as being like benevolent inspectors, is what he calls them. This was a common view among extreme nationalists. We won't go into today whether it's true or not, but it's well depicted. The landlord classes, just another word about it, they're quite well portrayed here as well. The Flahertys are good landlords, but their neighbours, the Burkes, are bad landlords. And Jerome Burke isn't just bad to his tenants, he's also bad to his wife, Lydia. And it's often noted that even though she's not a sympathetic character, people are sorry for her. Anna Parnell, sister of Charles Stewart Parnell and from a landlord background herself, said once, quote, "If the Irish landlords had deserved extinction for nothing else, they would have deserved it for the treatment of their women folk," end quote. And while it might seem strange to us nowadays to think of this, women of the landed classes were intensely vulnerable economically. They had to depend on the kind of settlements or dowries their fathers would make for them. George Moore's novel, A Drama in Muslin, which came out in the late 19th century, depicts the horribly mercenary marriage market that was around Dublin Castle. And what I think is very poignant in this novel is the way Anna, Alice's oldest daughter, who is from a landlord background, even though her mother is from a farming background, she's married off at 18 to the much older and not very well behaved James Fahey. And oddly, Dillon doesn't have much sympathy for her. She has great sympathy for Alice, though, and because Alice is from a small farmer background, she's a strong character. Like women were. Women from that background were very strong. They had an agency and freedom that was denied to women of a wealthier classes. But of course, they also had a lot of poverty to contend with. Now, I'm going to finish up by just saying that as a historian, I deal in generalities, and most historians do. We're interested in the majority experience, how many people emigrated, how many women worked in domestic service, how many people lived in fourth-class dwellings, and so on. But a historical novel like this reminds us of the importance of looking as well at individual experiences. And historians can sometimes make the mistake of assembling people in the past from a kind of a flat pack of economic and political realities and what we assume must have been people's attitudes and opinions and values. And we think that people always prioritised their economic and their political well-being. We assume, for example, that a labouring man would always have voted for a Labour candidate and so on, or we don't understand how somebody could have left a farm to emigrate to search after adventure and so on. Or indeed, as in the case of Morgan Connolly, that he would have left a reasonable livelihood on the farm to become a Fenian. And in fact, since so much of it across the Bitter Sea is preoccupied with Fenianism, I'm going to finish on this note. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a fashion among historians to depict the Fenianism in Ireland as a bit of a joke, to depict it as something that was just a pastime, just something for people to do of an evening. Comerford's book, Patriotism as Pastime, was about this. And Dillon's book brought me back to an appreciation of the men, and some women as well, who risked their lives, their livelihoods, their freedom, going to English jails, which are, as I said, portrayed very well, and restoring patriotism as an emotion as well as a political feeling at that time. So I think that even though, it shows as well the flexible class barriers and the way in which wealthy and not so wealthy people interacted, I think probably the most accurate historical contribution that this novel makes, I think, is to the way in which political feelings permeated people. It permeated and made kind of class barriers permeable as well around this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caitriona, for that fascinating paper. We're now going to return to Eileán Ní Chuilleanáin, who is going to read to us from The House on the Shore and The Island of Horses.
In my first reading, I was talking about the importance of tradition in Eilís's writing for children, especially the language, musical traditions, folk customs. All these things were terribly important to her. However, she was also interested, and this comes up a lot in her children's writing, in the modernization of Irish society. This, I think, comes largely from her father, Tommy Dillon, who, in his years as a professor of chemistry in NUI Galway, was very interested in the promotion of industry, especially industry based on the produce of the land, particularly seaweed, and she brings this into her children's book, The House on the Shore. In this book, a boy comes to a village in search of his uncle, and it turns out that the uncle is in very bad odour with the people because he has disappeared with the money which they had got together to start a factory based on the working of seaweed. The money that they have is because of earlier modernization projects. One man explains to him how at first he had difficulty in getting anybody to change the traditional ways. He has been to France because he was shipwrecked, and then there he had seen what could be done with marginal land. The moment we got home, I explained the plan to my father. He would not listen to me. He said the Connemara people had always been poor, and that if we could make a living at all between the fishing and the turf and the little bit of farming that we could do, we should be mighty thankful. I argued with him until my tongue was dry and until I had used up every single word that I knew, but it was no good. He said young people were always full of these cracked notions, and that I'd better not say anything about it to the neighbours, or they would think I had taken leave of my senses. He was a good, hard-working man, my father, but he had no vision. Then, 11 years ago, he died. I remember looking down at him at the wake, wishing him goodbye, and even with tears in my eyes, thinking to myself, now I'll drain the big valley. And then there's a description of what the valley looks like after they'd worked on it. With the misty autumn light, it was hard to guess at the size of it, but it seemed to me to be about 1.5 miles either way. The road ran along the seaside, and the cart continually crossed tiny bridges over the little canals that drained the land. These canals were about 4 foot wide and were filled with black, boggy-looking water. Here and there, light wooden bridges had been built over them so that one could go easily from one plot to the other. In between the canals there were smooth fields, some with stubble where a corn crop had been cut, others with potatoes still growing, and others again with turnips, mangels, and sugar beet. I had never seen the like in my life, though I had heard that in the eastern and southern parts of Ireland there were vast fields with never a hill, nor a hollow, nor an outcropping rock from end to end of them. But that such a sight should be here in Connemara was unbelievable. I'd like to read another bit about modernization, this time from The Island of Horses. In this novel, once again, there's a boy speaker. With a friend, he has discovered the Island of Horses, but then discovered that other people are interested in it as well. He ends up being shipwrecked. He and his friend come to shore and they go to a house. A man comes out. "You've been in the sea," he said. "Your boat is gone, I'm thinking, after the storm." We nodded. He leaned more comfortably on the door and brought up his other hand to cradle his pipe. "That just proves what I'm always saying," he sighed with a mixed air of impatience and satisfaction. "There should be a factory here for canning fish. Now, if there was a factory, you wouldn't bother going out fishing on a stormy night in a bad boat. You'd be working in the factory, drawing your money every week like a lord, instead of being in daily danger to life and limb out on the wild ocean. That's what I told the department. 247 letters they've had from me in the department about that canning factory, and not a stamp on a single one of them." His eyes sparkled with triumph. Pat said, a little tremulously, "Please, sir, we're hungry." But who would catch the fish? I could not resist asking the question, in spite of my exasperation. A moment later, I wished I had kept silent. He turned a coldly contemptuous eye on me, glinting angrily through his glasses. "It's people like you that are ruining this country," said he. people without vision, without enterprise, without imagination, people with small, mean minds, people that are only out for themselves. He laughed delicately. Of course you must be from one of the islands. I hear they're very backward out there. Backward they may be, I said hotly, but they would never leave a person standing hungry on the doorstep. They would ask him to come in and sit by the fire. They'd ask him, had he a mouth on him? They'd help him on his way instead of blowing old talk at them about factories for making fishes out of the little stones and selling them to the fairies.
Eileán, thank you for those lovely readings. In those readings, I think we get a sense of some of the qualities that your mother was trying to nurture in her young readers, such as, independent inquiry and curiosity and, resourcefulness. What do you think were the qualities that she was trying to, I suppose, promote in the new young citizens of a newly independent Ireland?
Well, I think there were qualities she felt the children had already if they weren't somehow bullied out of them. Yes, independence, a critical sense, the ability to think about adults in a critical way, the ability to relate to adults as to just other people rather than a different class that was down on top of them all the time. But also, of course, a sense of their own country. I mean, she wrote, for example, about how when she went to school first, there were school books that were left over from the British period, which was, we're talking about Hyde Park, and how when the new books came in, including books in Irish, all of a sudden you realised there was something about, there was writing about Ireland, about the places that they lived in and in their own language and idiom.
Yes, and indeed she was pioneering, really, because she kind of spawned a whole new literature for Irish children at a time when there was a real lack, a paucity of available literature for children in Ireland.
Yes, I think, I mean, there were other, I'm not an expert on children's literature, but there were other writers. But I think that some of them were inclined to go for the picturesque side of Irish life, and whereas she had a very good visual sense and a love of landscape, I think she also wanted to put it in touch with the modern world and the real world.
And the trope of the island is very interesting, and it recurs in her adventure stories for children. Can you maybe comment on that? Is that a kind of an objective correlative, one might say, a way of working through, being in an unusual space and finding the resources in oneself to develop, do you think, or?
I think it's partly, solves a technical problem for a children's writer, because you have a single scene on an island. You have a small cast of characters. You have the fact that island children were also, were considered to be in some way citizens. They had jobs of their own to do, looking after animals and so on. But also that school was important to them. One of the things that she considers quite a lot is whether the child with an education will stay on the island. And that's in one of her last children's books, The Island of Ghosts. There are two boys, one of whom leaves the island and goes to somewhere else, coming back for holidays, and the other one stays and farms with the girl that he went to school with on a nearby island, so doesn't lose touch with the original setting.
Okay, and it was also a way of tapping into her own history, her own childhood in the west of Ireland, and her great graw for Barna and for the maritime. Her descriptions of the ocean and the waves, are absolutely stunning.
Yes, I think that's what she missed in Cork. The full blast of the Atlantic.
And to come on to yourself and, your own mother, I suppose, your mum, you have some very tender, lovely recollections written about her in various essays. I'm thinking particularly of the collection, The Vibrant House, Irish Writing in Domestic Space. And you talk about the cello, her cycling out and the cello dangling at her feet, because of course she was very musical. You also talk about this lovely relationship you had where she had a cupboard full of censored books that were banned, and gradually as you got older she was opening the press and showing you a new censored book. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that might have influenced your writing?
Well, I suppose freedom of expression is one part of it. I do remember the first time I used a word in a poem that I'd never heard her use, but when she got to Cork, I think at first she was a bit disorientated, and then she discovered particularly a circle that was connected with the sculptor Seamus Murphy and his wife Mairead, who remained close friends to the end of her life. The people who went on later to do things like founding the Cork Film Festival, and of course the musical people, Alois Fleischmann and his orchestra. So they were the people who didn't really have very much time for the censorship and the limitations of Irish life at that time. I should mention, I suppose, Dermot Foley, who was the city librarian, who knew a lot about how to evade censorship.
And I think she writes about it in an article entitled Sean O'Phelan and the Young Writer, about knowing when to grab the books when they were just published before the censor got to them.
Yes, that's right.
And so there's a skill in that in itself.
Oh, indeed, yes. And you could see what was going to be banned, and also what had been written in the expectation that it would be banned.
Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah. And she talks about the censorship board being that great certifier of literary merit.
Yes. I'm afraid that was true at the time. Yes.
And to come on to your own writing and how she influenced you, Eileán, is it a profound influence there from your mum, do you think?
I think the idea that you have to do the very best you can. I mean, she particularly felt this about her children's writing. Well, she felt about it all the time, but she felt especially that children's writers could sometimes scamp the work. Yes. And the feeling that the language itself, even something I read there where she talks about the vowel sounds in Irish, she was very keen on the way you make vowel sounds ring off each other. And I sometimes find I'm unconsciously doing that and thinking, yes, that's what she told me to do.
Oh, that's lovely. And that's the musical influence coming in as well,
yes,
I suppose.
Indeed.
And her sense of assonance and the musicality. There's so many things I'd like to ask you, but I know our time is limited. You know, she said, I was born in Galway in 1920 into a world of ghosts. That's a remarkable line. And Dr. John Cunningham spoke earlier on about Dillon's ghosts. What do you think she's referring to there?
Well, I suppose, I mean, the loss in her family, the sense that people were impermanent, that that your mother could be dragged away.
Yes. Which she witnessed at the age of 1. She witnessed her mother being taken to prison.
But also, of course, the presence of history, the fact that she says this more than once, I think, that people spoke about Cromwell as if he'd been there last week.
Yes.
The fact that history could be in some ways telescoped, that it could be that the Irish. We know that the Irish historical memory is very long.
Yes.
I remember myself catching up with it only when I went to Antwerp, and they were talking about the sack of the city by the Spaniards in 1572, as if it had happened last week. And I thought, yes, this is just like Ireland.
Yes. And of course, Jim Higgins mentioned about the literary monument that she has created in the absence of, I suppose, in a period of taciturnity around the War of Independence and the Civil War, that your mother wrote about these issues, these difficult issues, and confronted them head on. And that legacy is there for us to enjoy now, particularly in the second phase of the decade of centenary celebrations.
I think she was aware always that it was a difficult subject. She never went in for simple celebration of heroism. And I think at that point, it might also, my father's influence might have come in as well. I mean, he had fought when he was a young man, and I think he had a few second thoughts, which he wasn't bothered to communicate very much, but he knew there were two sides to a lot of stories.
Yes.
And I think that communicated itself to her as well.
I know that, her parents were both strong Republicans, and yet the message of reconciliation comes right through in all her books. That the way forward is discussion rather than the militaristic approach. And I think that's a very strong, powerful message from her books. So just finally, in an article entitled Sean O'Whalan, the young writer, I mentioned it earlier, your mother writes, "We learned to work incessantly and indefatigably without hope of recognition, nor indeed hankering after it, except insofar as it might prove that we were doing a good job." So I'm just wondering, do you think that your mother, wherever she is up there, would be happy with the recognition that she's getting now in her centenary year, and that further research will be carried out on her body of writing? What do you think is especially important in her legacy, if I can ask you?
Okay, she would be happy, of course. I mean, she loved, she did get a good dose of celebrity with the publication of Across the Bitter Sea.
Yes.
That really helped. I'm quite sure that the answer to that is yes.
Yes.
More research, yes. I think that her work should be is taken seriously. Yes. A critic whom I won't name referred to one of her books as a shop girl's romance, and she was very cross on behalf of the shop girls as well as on her own behalf. So I think serious attention would gratify her. Yes. What's her legacy? For anybody, I think it's the work that somebody comes across, possibly saying, "I always meant to read that person, and now I'm going to do it."
And
that's
there's such a broad range.
Of a reader.
There's such a versatile. I mean, you can read a detective fiction, detective novel by her, which I found quite funny. I wasn't expecting the satire that in Death in the Quadrangle. And you can read her take on Irish history in Inside Ireland in her memoir, or you can read her historical novels or her children's books. The versatility is remarkable.
It comes from industry, sitting down and doing it day after day after day. Yes.
Thanks so much, Eileán. It was lovely to talk to you. And I'd also like to thank our earlier speakers, Honor Ó Brolchain, Caitriona Clear, and our musicians Tomás Mannion and Carmel Dempsey. Well, I hope you enjoyed our session on Eilís Dillon, Politics and Patriotism this evening. Gur míle maith agaibh a corda agus ihuaith.